All right, so our last video in this series of 4 is going to be on trauma theory and understanding cognitive behavioral theory in relation to trauma theory. So again, I'm Ryan M. Shade, LCSW, your therapist. I'm the guy your therapist comes to see for therapy. You can come see me for therapy too. But ultimately, so we've talked about cognitive behavioral theory. We've talked about how events don't lead directly to emotions in the theory. We talked about that these cognitive appraisals and schemas ultimately are the wall between our events and our emotions that change the meaning and power of the events. And we've talked about how that comes from early childhood, 5 to 10 years old, at least in my belief. And if we understand the core beliefs that we created for ourselves at those ages, then we can start to shift and be more balanced and rational in our schemas, right? I'm not good enough doesn't make sense, but I'm a person with some strengths and some weaknesses, and I can always get better. That does make sense. And so we can start to shift then our automatic thoughts, the ways that we interpret the world, which then leads to a shift in the emotions that we have. Everybody comes into my office wanting to have different emotions, and I have to explain to them and help them understand that the only way, as far as I'm concerned, to change your emotions is by changing your cognitive appraisals, is by changing your schemas, is by changing the way you think and behave. Cognitive behavioral therapy, that's what ultimately ends up changing our entire experience of the world. So the last point that I told you last time that I was going to talk about was trauma theory. And trauma theory is really easy. If you know anything about EMDR, which stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, started by Francine Shapiro in the late 1980s for combat trauma. But what we've realized is that none of us escape trauma. And if you watch my last video, I talked about how childhood has this sort of ability to create trauma. Even things that look from an adult perspective as fairly innocuous can be very traumatic to children. So in EMDR theory, there's what's called the adaptive information processing model. And what Dr. Shapiro wanted to know was if the body is naturally adaptive. If I get a cut on my hand, it will heal itself. Right? I don't have to stare at it. I basically have to keep it clean, get myself rest and nutrition roughly. But even if I don't, most of the time it'll still heal itself, just take a little bit longer. But my body is naturally adaptive. It wants health. I break a bone, my body has these amazing resources to send all of this material to my bones to actually weld the bone basically together. And then it will take off the extra bone that it welded. It's amazing, right? So she wanted to know, does the brain actually also have this naturally adaptive experience? And what she determined was, yes, it does. And the adaptive information processing model says that the vast majority of the things that happen to us, we go through, we experience, and then we let them go. And then we move to the next one. But anything that we can call trauma as a shock to the system is something that short circuits that ability to adaptively let it go and then move forward, and it gets stuck in the brain and in the experience. And ultimately, if you look at post-traumatic stress symptoms, big symptoms of post-traumatic stress are nightmares, so your brain reminds you of the trauma while you're asleep, flashbacks, so your brain reminds you of the trauma while you're awake, and hypervigilance, being constantly aware and consistently aware. That makes total sense adaptively. If you think about the fact that, as far as I'm concerned, we have a 50,000-year-old brain. Evolution moves incredibly slowly. Technology has ramped us up incredibly quickly. And so we have this brain that's not caught up to all of the different things that we experience today. 150 years ago, humans thought that if you went over 100 miles an hour, if the human body went over 100 miles an hour in some way, it would break apart. Now, if you have an automobile, that automobile can probably go over 100 miles an hour every single day if you really wanted to. Don't do it, but you know what I mean. So if we have this very, very rapid increase in our life expectancy, in the technology and all the things that we can do, we're not adapted to handle this. We have these brains that are basically set to chill in the jungle 50,000 years ago, and we're walking, and let's say a saber-toothed cat jumps out of the bushes and tries to eat us. Then, if that happens to me, and I somehow escape that, right? I fight it off or I run away from it, my fight or flight response, then my brain is set, my limbic system is set into anything that even might be a saber-toothed cat, I need to freak out. So I can be walking through the jungle a week or two later, once I can finally get the courage to leave my cave, and there could be a tiny bush this big, and it rustles. And my cognition says that is a bird or a lizard or something like that. There's no way that's a saber-toothed cat because the bush is so small, but my limbic system doesn't care. It would rather see a threat that isn't there than miss a threat that is, right? So it goes right into fight or flight again. The problem is, if I have, let's say, a combat veteran in my office who says, I know that thing on the side of the road is a piece of tire, but everything in my body says it's an IED that's going to explode like the one that did and killed a number of the members of my platoon. So everything in me says go hide in a closet. And the thing is, hiding in a closet technically, quote unquote, would work in the sense that you probably won't get blown up by an IED if you're hiding in the closet. The biggest issue with that is, what kind of life is that when you're 22 years old and you have another 60 years statistically or more to live on the planet? That becomes the problem. What keeps us safe can also make us miserable because our limbic system doesn't care if we're miserable as long as we're safe from the danger. So we have to understand that, and then we have to understand schemas in relation to that. Because once we understand the schemas that way, then we can start to say, okay, do I need this anymore? Is this helpful or useful for me? Instead of just saying, well, yeah, I have the emotion because that thing happened. And that's what's key, and that's what's important to understand, that all of this, trauma theory says that we have unprocessed early memories, at least EMDR theory does, unprocessed early memories. And cognitive behavioral theory says we have negative core beliefs, maladaptive schemas about ourselves. It's all the same stuff though, and it all comes from the same place. So the key, and the reason that therapy can be so effective, especially good therapy, is that you have somebody who understands this and can take your stuff and put it in the context of the theory to help you understand that as we can change the schemas, which by the way is not a magic pill, it's not a magic bullet, it takes a while, and it takes work, and it takes pain, and it takes effort. But once we understand these things, then we can shift, and we can shift the ways that we're experiencing to then move and change and grow and learn. And in 1978, Scott Peck wrote a book called The Road Less Traveled. And in The Road Less Traveled, the first sentence he says is, life is difficult, which we know. We know more than ever, life is difficult. But he goes on to say that once we accept it, we transcend it. And once we accept that it's difficult, then it's not difficult because we just accept it and keep going. And he talks about in the second page of the book that problems create our courage and our wisdom in solving problems. I told my 13-year-old, we were talking about math, and I said, how do you get better at math? What does your teacher give you? And he said, homework? And I said, yeah, but what's on the homework? And he said, math problems. And I said, right, so you get better at math by solving math problems, right? And he said, yes. And I said, how do you suppose people get better at life? And he stops for a second and he said, solving life problems? And I said, exactly. And then of course he rolled his eyes and said, oh, why do you keep doing that? Because my poor kids. But the idea is that, yes, life is difficult. Yes, this process is difficult. Yes, this is not a magic bullet or a magic pill or something that doesn't take effort. But when you put in the effort and when you work with someone good, you can make significant shifts on this stuff. And as you make the significant shifts, you do better, the world does better, everyone does better. So I want you to understand this, and then I want you to work with somebody who can help you even more if you can't get there fully yourself, because nobody has better perspective on themselves than someone outside themselves, right? And so if we can all understand this and start to make our shifts. Last point to make before I end this video is this theory basically says it's not the events, but it's the meaning and power that we give to events, right? This is the core foundation of every spiritual philosophy that I've ever seen. Because spiritual philosophies tend to be about love and acceptance. And maybe there are some, somebody comment probably at some point that there are some that aren't about that. Okay, but the vast majority of the major human spiritual movements and philosophies are about love and acceptance. And about, it's not what happens in meaning and power you give to what happens. It's let go, let God in Christianity. It's a natural ebb and flow of the universe in certain forms of Judaism, like Kabbalah, the way that I understand it. And ultimately, you can't fight against it, so you might as well go with the ebb and flow. It's the Four Noble Truths of the Buddha, almost exactly. If you understand the Four Noble Truths, life is suffering. Suffering arises from desire. Desire can't be quenched, and then the Eightfold Path of the Buddha. But ultimately, we suffer here because we want things to be different than they are, rather than learning how to accept what things are, change the things that we can, right? Sound like the Serenity Prayer and 12-step as well? God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. It's cognitive behavioral theory, which is probably some 6,000-year-old theory from a tribal community. But humans have been talking about this for years. Take it out of the spiritual realm. The Stoic philosophers, Epictetus said 2,000 years ago, it is not the events of a man's life that creates his reality, but how he interprets them, right? It's not the events of a man's life, but the way he interprets them that creates his reality. Marcus Aurelius is on my wall in my practice office. Marcus Aurelius said in the year 124 that our life is what our thoughts make it. That's this. It's not new. Every time a book comes out, oh, look at this new thing. It's not new, but we don't get it. And so I want you guys to get it. Hopefully this helps you get it so that you can start seeing that this is incredibly important. And as we do the work, and especially in the context of COVID-19, and especially in the context of scary things happening, we have to understand how we're reacting to then be able to make that change. Thank you so much. Reach out to a local therapist. Reach out to anyone. My practice is called Integrated Mental Health Associates in Scottsdale, Arizona. We're actually doing teletherapy right now to make sure people don't have risk as far as the COVID stuff. But reach out and do the work that you need to do. There are therapists across the country who are doing teletherapy, so you don't even have to put yourself at physical risk to be able to do the work that you need to do. All right, I'm Ryan M. Shade, LCSW, therapist. I hope that this 4-video series helped you. I hope you got something out of it. I hope you know more about yourself now, and now you will reach out and continue to do the work that we all really need to do. All right, take care of you, okay? And wash your hands.